Hey guys, tonight we're wandering through the ghostly stillness left behind after the Black Death swept through Europe. The year is somewhere in the late 1340s, maybe creeping into the early 1350s, and you're standing at the edge of a village. Except there's no one home. You're staring down a weedy path lined with houses that have their doors ajar, shutters flapping gently in the breeze, and silence so thick it feels like it's pressing on your ears. You don't hear laughter, livestock, haggling, or gossip, just crows. Always the crows. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the gate to a crumbling cottage, careful not to trip over the wild rye that's grown where a tidy path used to be. Inside, there's the faint scent of old ash and something vaguely metallic. Decay, or memory. Someone left their wooden spoon still in the pot. It's been like this for months, maybe a year. In some regions, entire villages were simply abandoned. The Black Death, caused by Yersinia pestis bacteria, often spread via fleas on rats, had hit so hard there just weren't enough survivors to keep life going. England alone may have lost nearly half its population in just a couple of years. The fields lay fallow, tools rusted in barns, and churches echoed with empty pews. But here's where it gets interesting. That emptiness? It wasn't just eerie. It was an opportunity. Suddenly, there were more resources than people. Fields ready to plant, tools ready to use, animals wandering without owners. If you had the courage, or maybe just nowhere else to go, you could move in and try to make something of it. This is when you start noticing a subtle but massive shift in who holds the power. Before the plague, you might have begged a lord for a patch of land or a scrap of bread. Now, lords are sending their stewards out with leaflets. Well, the 14th century version of leaflets, basically shouting, "Please, please come farm this land. You can keep more of the harvest this year." And just like that, the old peasant economy started to wobble. This didn't happen overnight, of course. In some parts of Europe, things returned to a grim version of normal for a while, just with fewer people to complain about it. But elsewhere, the ground was shifting underfoot. Entire manors had collapsed without their laborers. In other places, communities of survivors banded together and just kept the place running themselves. No lord, no rent, just people doing what had to be done. It's one of those moments where historians still argue whether this was proto-democracy or just desperate squatting with better marketing. You hear about these places, these deserted medieval villages, in history books like they're myths. But they were very real. In England alone, over 1,000 such villages vanished during and after the Black Death. Some are buried under modern roads now. Others are just grassy mounds where the church used to be, still haunted by sheep. But imagine stumbling across one of these places centuries ago. Maybe you're a wanderer with no family left. Maybe you were kicked out of your old village for stealing a turnip during the famine. Now you see this empty hamlet with a roof that mostly still holds, a stone well, and chickens that look just feral enough to claim. You don't wait for permission, you move in. This land reoccupation was so common that some towns had to send guards to keep strangers from squatting in abandoned homes. Others just gave up and rebranded themselves as new towns, hoping to attract a fresh batch of humans before everything turned into forest again. And yes, nature came roaring back. Without constant human activity, fields sprouted wildflowers. Wolves reappeared in Western Europe. Beavers had a renaissance. You were just as likely to see a deer in the street as a neighbor. Nature wasn't healing. It was taking the keys and changing the locks. Of course, that wasn't always good news. Rewilding meant more danger, more unpredictability. Overgrown fields meant more rats. And more rats meant, well, let's just say a lot of people developed a pretty severe case of plague PTSD. Some towns even tried blaming second outbreaks on witches or foreign travelers because they couldn't accept that the fleas had stuck around. And so, in the shadow of all that emptiness, you start to see the very early signs of transformation. It's quiet now, but this is the start of something loud. A world is rebuilding itself, not by royal decree or noble command, but out of necessity. People are surviving by adapting, not obeying. And as we'll see next, some of them are starting to get very bold about it. You're still trudging through a mostly empty village, but this one isn't abandoned. It's just sparse. The baker's gone, but his apprentice is trying to keep the oven hot. There's a boy herding sheep who should still be playing with wooden toys. And you? You've just overheard something that would have been shocking a few years ago. A peasant haggling, boldly, loudly. He's talking to a steward, and he's refusing to accept last year's wages. Imagine that. I'll only shear your sheep if you feed my family for a week and throw in 2 chickens, he says. The steward looks like he's choking on his own scroll. This is the post-plague labor market, and it's gone rogue. Before the Black Death, the world was locked in a rigid hierarchy. Serfs worked land they didn't own, answered to lords who barely knew their names, and got paid in scraps, if anything. The nobility didn't just own property, they owned time, sweat, even your kid's future. But now, with so many workers dead, demand was suddenly greater than supply. Fewer hands meant each one mattered more. And so, you start to see the rise of something almost revolutionary: leverage. If you were a surviving laborer, especially a young, healthy one, you had options. A nearby manor lost all its workers. You could walk over, name your price, and probably get it. Want me to harvest your grain before it rots? That'll cost you. You weren't just surviving anymore. You were negotiating. Historians still argue whether this created a true golden age for peasants, or if that's a bit too romantic. After all, not everyone benefited. Some places remained locked in old systems. Some landlords cracked down harder than ever, determined to regain control. But undeniably, across huge swaths of Europe, peasants got louder, bolder, and, brace yourself, hopeful. It's around this time that you start hearing murmurs of mobility. Not in the sense of carriages and moving vans. No, this is social mobility. Sons of serfs imagining futures where their children might own land. Daughters dreaming of marrying above their station. People who used to live generation after generation in one damp cottage now thinking, what if we left? What if we moved to town? Of course, not everyone liked this new confidence. The lords? Absolutely not. For centuries, they'd enjoyed a nice, quiet peasant class who knew their place and died on time. Now that same class was asking for better wages, fewer workdays, and even, gasp, personal freedom. Let's say you're working on an estate in Norfolk. You've survived the plague, buried your family, and now the steward says you're needed to bring in the barley. You squint at him and say, "Not unless you double the wages and throw in ale." It sounds cheeky, but it wasn't unheard of. The demand for labor was so high that lords were competing for workers. Some even resorted to bribery, offering better housing, tax breaks, or promises of future land rights. Others tried flatter incentives, like letting workers eat from the lord's own pantry. Imagine being a peasant and biting into cheese that hadn't come out of a moldy root cellar. That's borderline royal. In towns, skilled laborers, like blacksmiths or coopers, began charging higher rates. Guilds in cities expanded, sometimes reluctantly letting in rural workers who were willing to learn. A whole generation of ambitious survivors was climbing the social ladder rung by shaky rung. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. In one case recorded in England, a man named Roger the Carter, previously considered a commoner, married the daughter of a landholding widow simply because he showed up when others didn't. That's right. No money, no nobility, just availability. It's like the 14th century version of he has a car. But don't let this fool you into thinking everyone was on the up and up. A lot of resentment simmered below the surface. Old money didn't like being outmaneuvered by muddy-booted opportunists. Some lords responded by trying to tie workers back down, literally. This tension between freedom and control is a key theme after the plague. It's the growing crack in the old feudal armor. You've got peasants with bargaining power, lords getting desperate, and an entire economy shifting from tradition to whatever works. That steward you saw earlier, the one clutching his scroll and blinking at the haggling peasant, he's about to write a very angry letter to the king. And that's where we'll go next. Because, surprise, the monarchy doesn't like it when peasants start thinking they're people. The year is 1351. You're standing in a market square, listening to a town crier screech out a royal proclamation. He's got spittle on his beard and righteous fire in his eyes. By order of His Majesty, King Edward III, he bellows, all laborers must accept the same wages as before the pestilence, and any refusal shall be met with punishment. You blink. Did the king just outlaw pay raises? Yes. Yes, he did. Welcome to the age of government panic, also known as the Statute of Laborers. You see, the ruling classes weren't exactly thrilled with your new peasant swagger. After decades of treating you like walking compost, they weren't prepared for you to suddenly become valuable, and worse, mobile. You weren't supposed to go wherever you wanted, demand what you liked, or, heaven forbid, ask for a day off. So the government did what governments sometimes do when faced with a workforce getting too cheeky. It tried to rewind the clock with parchment and ink. The Statute of Laborers was essentially the Crown's way of saying, whoa, 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 none of this nonsense about fair wages. Back to serf stuff, please. It set strict limits on wages, made it illegal to refuse work at pre-plague rates, and tried to freeze the labor market like some sort of royal fridge. Historians still argue whether this was a serious attempt at economic control or just aristocratic flailing. Some say it was meant to soothe the noble ego more than actually function. Others argue it laid the groundwork for later class conflict by turning post-plague recovery into a tug-of-war between law and livelihood. On the ground, the result was chaos. Imagine you're a thatcher. Before the plague, you'd earn a few coins and maybe a chicken for fixing a roof. Now someone's offering you triple that to travel 10 miles and work for a manor that lost all its staff. But if you say yes, you're a criminal. That's right. Accepting a better deal gets you fined, or worse, publicly shamed. To enforce all this, the government expanded its bureaucracy. Justices of the peace started prowling rural areas, collecting complaints, investigating wage offenses, and doling out punishment. You could be dragged to court just for switching jobs without permission. There's even a quirky little case from Yorkshire involving a man named Henry of Derby, who was accused of luring farmhands away from a rival village by promising 3 eggs a week and meat on Sundays. That's how desperate employers had become, and how petty the legal response was. Henry was fined. The eggs were confiscated. Presumably the meat was eaten by someone important. And yet, enforcement was patchy at best. There just weren't enough officials to monitor everyone. Many communities ignored the rules entirely. Others worked around them, paying extra bonuses in kind, baskets of grain, a goat on the sly, or a wedding gift that just happened to arrive after harvest. It all became this surreal theater of compliance, everyone pretending to follow the rules while quietly stuffing silver coins into each other's boots under the table. Meanwhile, those at the top were furious. Lords accused one another of undercutting wages. Cities complained of rural workers flooding in and driving up prices. Even the church joined the chorus, preaching against the vanity of poor people dressing too well. That's right. If your tunic started looking a little less patched, someone might accuse you of moral decline. Because make no mistake, this wasn't just about wages. It was about order. Who got to have status? Who got to rise? Who got to ask, why not me? And that's where things got extra spicy. The statute didn't kill ambition. It sharpened it. Workers began banding together, forming proto-unions or local collectives, agreeing on fair wages among themselves, and punishing those who undercut the group. In towns, guilds expanded their influence, setting terms not just for pay, but for working hours, training, and trade routes. It was the beginning of something deeply unsettling to the old guard: solidarity. Even in the countryside, whispers of rebellion floated through taverns and fields. Peasants started keeping records, reading, writing, organizing. You weren't just a body swinging a sickle. You were starting to look dangerously like a citizen. Of course, there were still plenty of poor folks crushed under debt, obligation, and bad luck. The plague hadn't made the world fair. It had just shaken the snow globe. Where the flakes landed next was anybody's guess, but this moment, this royal attempt to shove the genie back in the bottle, it tells you everything about the fear in the air, not of another plague, but of change. And as we'll see in the next village, where fences have mysteriously shifted and livestock wander freely, this fear wasn't just among kings and lords, because the land itself was starting to change hands. And once that happens, you can kiss the old world goodbye. You're walking along a muddy road that winds through open countryside, but it doesn't feel so open anymore. Low stone walls have appeared where you don't remember any being before. A pasture that used to be common land, free to graze, gather firewood, or let the kids chase geese, is now fenced off, marked with a suspiciously shiny wooden gate. And standing there, arms crossed, is someone who looks very sure of their new boundaries. Welcome to the great post-plague land grab. With so many people dead, landowners were scrambling to make sense of their patchy estates. Some manors had no heirs left, their lords buried along with their servants. Others were in disarray, fields untended, cottages collapsing, granaries empty except for the occasional snoozing rat. But for the ambitious, this was a rare chance to get ahead. If you had even a little coin, a decent reputation, or the right marriage alliance, you could scoop up property like it was clearance day at the feudal supermarket. Land that had been locked away in noble lineages for generations was suddenly up for grabs. If you could convince the right clerk, outbid the next widow, or just move in and not leave. Historians still argue whether this redistribution of land was revolutionary or just opportunistic. But either way, it changed the map. Literally. Take the rise of the yeoman class. These were folks who weren't quite nobility, but definitely weren't peasants anymore. They farmed their own land, often profiting from its productivity, and started forming a rural middle class. You might be one of them if you found yourself inheriting a cousin's field, then marrying a former servant who just so happened to bring a flock of sheep to the relationship. And speaking of sheep, oh boy, sheep were the new hotness. Wool was becoming Europe's most profitable export, and with so many abandoned fields, it made sense to let the land go wild and fill it with sheep instead of laborers. Sheep don't ask for wages. They don't strike. And they don't complain about the statute of laborers. This shift from farming to sheep herding led to what you now know as enclosure. Common lands, once shared by village communities, were fenced off by private landowners. Suddenly, what was once everyone's field became mine, not yours. It's like someone cordoned off your local park and started charging admission to look at cows. You, as a landless laborer, now find yourself shut out of the very land your grandparents worked for free. You can't graze your goat there anymore. You can't collect firewood. And if you step over that new fence, you might be greeted by a hired guard with a stick and no sense of humor. This slow privatization was devastating to many. It drove people out of villages, pushed them into towns, or forced them into wage labor on the very land they used to share. The social fabric of rural life began to fray. What was once community survival started to look more like a property ladder. But not everyone lost out. Some clever folk, maybe even you, saw the shift and leaned into it. You save up, buy a strip of land, raise sheep, and start selling wool to merchants in the next town over. Before you know it, you're rubbing elbows with guildsmen and sending your kid to grammar school. That kid might go on to become a lawyer, a merchant, maybe even a member of parliament someday. All thanks to one very convenient plague. There's even a cheeky story from East Anglia about a man named Simon the Shepherd who reportedly made so much from wool sales that he bought the estate his grandfather once tilled as a serf. When asked how he managed it, he supposedly shrugged and said, "The rats cleared it out for me. bit grim, bit true. Still, the resentment grew. Villagers who'd once worked side by side now found themselves divided, literally, by walls, hedges, and contracts. Whole communities split over disputes about who had rights to what. Some lands were contested for decades, passed through courts and cousins like hot potatoes. And when those disputes boiled over, riots, protests, occasional arson. It's one thing to lose your land to a noble. It's another to lose it to your former neighbor who suddenly thinks he's nobility because he owns a hill with a tree on it. So here you are, watching the land change. Not just who owns it, but how it's used, who it's for, and who gets locked out. The world is moving from communal survival to personal gain, and that shift, quiet as it seems, will shape the next several centuries. Next up, we peek inside a church and find that even God seems rattled by what's happened. You push open the creaking door of a stone church, and it's like stepping into a space that forgot how to breathe. The air is cold, damp, and smells faintly of mildew, candle wax, and something unplaceably sad. A handful of parishioners sit scattered across the pews, eyes hollow, hands idle. The priest is up at the altar, mumbling Latin not so much out of conviction, but habit. You sit quietly, and you realize something strange. Nobody's really listening. Because in the wake of the plague, faith has become a very wobbly thing. The Black Death didn't just kill bodies, it bruised souls. The church, once the rock of medieval life, suddenly seemed more like sandstone, crumbling under the weight of its own silence. When the pestilence came, prayers didn't stop it. Saints didn't save you. Holy relics, pilgrimages, masses, none of it seemed to work, and the people noticed. Before the plague, religion was baked into your daily life. From sunrise to sundown, God watched you. Your sins were tallied. Your penance was pre-written. And the church, the great gatekeeper. But after you watched your priest die in the street, after the bishop refused to bury your sister for fear of infection, after the last rites were muttered through a shut door, well, something inside you tilted. And it wasn't just you. Across Europe, entire monasteries were wiped out. In some cases, only 1 or 2 monks were left to ring the bells and tend the herb gardens. Those who survived were often the young, the reckless, or the frankly unqualified. Desperate times made for desperate ordinations. In more than one parish, a priest was just a guy who didn't sneeze for 2 weeks. Historians still argue whether this led to the church's long-term decline or just a temporary crisis of confidence. But what's undeniable is that the sacred sheen wore thin. Pilgrims questioned the point of their journeys. Villagers started skipping confession. Donations to the church dropped in places, while in others, people gave more out of fear that the plague might return if God wasn't pleased. You also see the rise of strange new religious movements, flagellants marching through towns, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of divine mercy. Fringe sects claiming the end was near, that the plague was punishment for secret sins. Some blamed Jews, lepers, or heretics, anyone who could serve as a scapegoat for the unexplainable. In many towns, that led to terrifying violence, pogroms, and hysteria that only deepened the fractures in the church's authority. But for every burst of fanaticism, there was someone quietly questioning the whole thing. like a young woman in Bohemia who decided she could pray at home just as well as in a plague-ridden chapel, or a grizzled old farmer who, when asked why he hadn't gone to Mass, replied, "The rats don't go either." That's dark. That's also kind of fair. You even see priests themselves begin to doubt. Some leave the church, others stay, but become more philosophical, less about fire and brimstone, more about forgiveness. The sermons start sounding different, softer in tone, almost apologetic. And then there's the art. Oh, the art. Everywhere you go now, you see death. Not just actual death, but paintings of it, sculptures, manuscripts with dancing skeletons, smiling corpses, and popes being dragged to the afterlife next to paupers. This dance macabre, or dance of death, becomes the medieval equivalent of a TikTok trend, except it lasts for decades and involves a lot more skulls. Even stained glass windows start showing things that would have once been considered blasphemous. Death personified. Death mocking the living. A bishop arguing with a grinning skeleton. It's not nihilism exactly. It's a form of collective therapy. If death is always near, maybe laughing at it keeps it at bay. A quirky little example. In one church mural from the 1360s, death is shown wearing a bishop's mitre and grinning like he's just told a very inappropriate joke. That image? Approved by the local clergy. The tone of faith was shifting from triumph to survival. And while the church tried to hold on, reinforcing doctrine, tightening rules, cracking down on heretical texts, its hold was loosening. Literacy was spreading. People were reading on their own, thinking on their own, interpreting scripture in ways that weren't always sanctioned. Seeds were being planted, seeds that, in a century or so, would bloom into full-on reformation. But right now you're sitting in that chilly chapel, hearing a hymn that sounds more like a dirge, and you can't help but wonder, if heaven didn't stop the plague, maybe heaven isn't where you should be looking. Maybe your answers lie in the land, in trade, in law, in science, or just in each other. And outside, under the low gray sky, life is moving again, slowly, strangely, and with a new curiosity. The people are still here, scarred, shaken, but here, and they're starting to express their survival in the strangest of ways. Velvet hats, tight hose, and ankle bells. Because next, it's fashion's turn to get weird. You're walking through the center of a bustling town, and something feels off. There's a man in a full velvet outfit. Even his shoes have curled toes so long they practically need scaffolding. A woman passes by wearing sleeves wide enough to catch birds in flight. Someone nearby is carving a wooden skull, humming cheerfully, and every shop window displays some kind of grotesque artwork. Dancing skeletons, grinning corpses, monks shaking hands with death like it's a business transaction. Welcome to the post-plague fashion show, where death is in vogue and taste has packed up and left the building. After the Black Death, people responded to mortality with two very different instincts, despair and extravagance, and often both at the same time. You'd think surviving a plague would inspire humility. But no. In town after town, people who came through the horror started dressing like peacocks who'd seen the abyss. Nobles wrapped themselves in imported silks, dyed fabrics with deep blues and crimsons, and stitched pearls into their sleeves. Even ordinary folks began investing in extra buttons, decorative buttons, mind you, because functional fashion was for pre-plague peasants. One chronicler grumbled that even kitchen wenches now wore girdles of silk and garlands in their hair. Imagine that, garlands, in the stew. Historians still argue whether this surge in fashion was an act of celebration, defiance, or compensation. Was it about showing off survival? About pretending things were back to normal? Or was it more of a medieval version of YOLO? The church, of course, hated it. Sumptuary laws were passed all over Europe, legal codes dictating who could wear what based on class. A merchant couldn't dress like a noble. A servant couldn't wear velvet. Even shoelaces were sometimes regulated. But as you might expect, people ignored these rules with gleeful creativity. There's a quirky little record from Florence where a man was fined for wearing red leather boots, too fancy for his station. He defended himself by claiming they were a gift from his dead uncle's wardrobe, which may have been true, but also a very on-brand excuse for the time. And while fashion got louder, art got darker. You wander into a merchant's home and see tapestries depicting not unicorns or saints, but plague scenes, grim reapers, mass burials, skeletal lovers locked in eternal embrace. Welcome to the visual genre historians call memento mori. Remember you will die. These weren't meant to be depressing. In a twisted way, they were comforting. If death was unavoidable, why pretend otherwise? Better to keep it close. Better to laugh at it, decorate with it, even flirt with it. You pass a street musician singing a new ballad about death wooing a young woman at a feast. It's catchy, grim, but catchy. Even literature got in on the act. Take the Decameron, written by Giovanni Boccaccio just after the plague swept through Florence. It's a book about 10 young people escaping the pestilence by telling each other funny, raunchy, and occasionally tragic stories. It's like a medieval sleepover with existential dread lurking just off stage. And it became wildly popular. What's happening is a psychological shift. Death had lost its mystery. It had knocked on everyone's door. So people turned it into a character, a neighbor, a recurring theme. It became common to sign letters with little skull doodles or rhyming phrases like, "As I am now, so you shall be." Cheery. You even see changes in tomb art. Gone are the pristine, noble stone effigies. Now you get cadavered tombs, stone figures showing the deceased in two forms, peaceful in life above, rotting and wormy below. A visual 2-for-1. Sleep tight. And yet, amidst the darkness, life sparkled in strange new ways. Music began to shift. Some churches added polyphonic choral works, layered harmonies that sounded richer, fuller, almost defiant. In cities like Paris and London, street performers grew in number. Puppet shows, acrobats, fire eaters, anything to distract, to entertain, to remind people they were alive. And then there were the bells, towns filled with bells, not just for mass or curfew, but for festivals, feasts, and weddings that now occurred more often, louder, and with more cheese. The people had stared death in the face, and they responded by dressing better, singing louder, and commissioning art that would make a modern-day funeral director blush. You don't know how long this spirit will last. The fear lingers, but so does this unexpected hunger for life, colorful, decadent, absurd life. and as you stroll past a group of children jumping rope next to a fresco of death playing the fiddle, you can't help but smile. The plague took a lot, but not imagination, not humor, not hope. And next, we'll step into the cities being rebuilt, not just structurally, but with fresh ideas in stone, wood, and brick. You step into the outskirts of a town that feels different. Not just the usual muck and masonry, something cleaner, wider. There's space between the buildings. Windows are bigger, streets are straighter, You blink and realize someone's planning this, like with actual forethought, which, in medieval urban terms, is practically witchcraft. Welcome to the slow, brick-by-brick reinvention of the medieval city. Before the plague, most towns grew like spilled soup. Whatever stuck, stayed. Alleys twisted wherever goats decided to sleep. Homes were piled atop shops, which were built into workshops, which backed into outhouses that politely ignored every building regulation that didn't exist. But after the Black Death, with so many dead, cities had room to breathe. Quite literally. You're walking past a section of town where the houses are brand new, timber frames still fresh, thatch not yet bird-nested. This whole street didn't exist a few years ago. Why? Because half the original population vanished, and what was once overcrowded chaos became a planner's blank canvas. Many cities took this horrifying opportunity to rethink their layouts. Some widened streets to allow better air circulation, since miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad air, was the medieval health buzzword of the day. Fresh air meant health. Health meant wealth. Wealth meant taxes. Everyone wins, especially the tax collector. But it's not just wider roads. There's drainage now. Gutters, ditches, even public latrines in a few bold locations. You almost cry when you see one. Not because it's pretty, but because it means fewer surprise puddles around every corner. It's the little things. Historians still argue whether these urban changes were truly systemic or just scattered survival strategies. Some towns doubled down on tradition. Others reimagined themselves almost from the ground up. The difference often depended on who had money, how bad the outbreak had been, and whether the mayor had any architectural ambitions or just liked doodling in the margins of tax ledgers. A quirky tidbit for you. In Milan, when the plague broke out, city officials supposedly ordered the entire destruction of affected homes. Walls, roofs, foundations, everything, just to contain the infection. That left huge empty plots once things settled, which became prime real estate for a shiny new Milanese makeover. Morbid urban renewal, but effective. And while most towns didn't go quite that extreme, many followed a similar path. Clear the worst hit zones, resettle survivors, and, crucially, start zoning things. No more tanning leather next to the bakery. No more fishmongers right outside the alehouse. Well, unless they bribed someone. Speaking of alehouses, post-plague cities leaned hard into public life. With trauma still fresh, people wanted community, connection, and comfort food. Taverns became social hubs, town squares got facelifts, and guild halls popped up like medieval co-working spaces. With fewer beanbags and more roast pig, you pass a bustling market square that didn't exist 10 years ago. It's flanked by stone buildings instead of the usual rickety wood. Why? Because after watching your neighbors' homes burn to stop an outbreak, you start investing in fireproofing. Stone became a statement. This house will last longer than your cough. In some places, public health boards emerged. Primitive by modern standards, sure, but they mattered. Cities like Venice began appointing officials specifically to monitor sanitation and quarantine. They'd inspect ships, burn contaminated goods, and occasionally seal off entire neighborhoods. You could be locked inside your home for 40 days. The origin of the word quarantine, from 40 giorni. It wasn't perfect. Plague still returned in waves. But each time, cities got a little sharper, a little faster, a little more organized. The same way trauma reshapes people, the Black Death was reshaping place. And it wasn't just physical. Cities started to think of themselves as engines, not just of commerce or governance, but of ideas. With so many scholars, monks, and laymen dead, universities opened their doors to new kinds of students. Towns sponsored local schools. Literacy rates crept up. You could almost feel a new mood setting in, curiosity mixed with grit. There's a low buzz in the air now. Not fear, something else, something like ambition. It'll take another generation, maybe two, before people start calling this period the early stirrings of the Renaissance. But it's already visible in the geometry of the streets, in the proportional windows, in the stone plazas where philosophers-to-be might someday debate over stew. And you, wandering through these smarter, straighter, still sooty cities, you can feel it too. The past is still here, in the plague pits and the painted skulls. But the future? It's under construction. And next, we'll take a step back, squint at the bigger picture, and trace just how permanently this plague twisted the world, and what strange new shapes it left behind. You stand now on a quiet hillside, overlooking fields stitched with stone walls and smoke curling gently from chimneys far below. It's calm, but from this height you can see the world has rearranged itself. Like a tablecloth yanked too hard, everything's shifted. Some things shattered, others just askew. And somehow, impossibly, life has carried on. What happened after the Black Death wasn't just a recovery. It was a transformation. You think back to what the world looked like before, a place of rigid hierarchy, slow social mobility, and generations bound to land they didn't own. Now, everything's looser, more dangerous, sure, but also more open. Labor is no longer just a footnote. It's valuable. People talk about wages, contracts, and terms. You hear of revolts rising from fields and forests, like the Peasants' revolt in England in 1381, just a few decades after the worst of the plague. Angry workers marched on London, demanding justice, better pay, the end of serfdom. They didn't get everything, but the world noticed. Once peasants taste power, it's hard to put that hunger back in its cage. Historians still argue whether the Black Death caused the end of feudalism or just nudged along changes already brewing. Some say it was inevitable. Others say without the plague we might still be swearing fealty and trading eggs for thatch. Either way, this much is true. Nothing stayed the same. Trade networks shifted. With fewer people, goods had to travel farther. Ports boomed. New cities flourished. The seeds of global capitalism were quietly dropped into plague-soaked soil. Education, too, saw cracks in its old walls. With so many clergy gone, students of humble origin were suddenly welcome in places they'd never been before: monasteries, universities, libraries. The plague may have dimmed the candlelight, but it also opened the door to a wider crowd. And the medicine? Oh dear, it was still full of urine charts, bloodletting, and the occasional poultice made of pigeon droppings. But there was momentum. People started recording symptoms, comparing outcomes. Hospitals, primitive and terrifying as they were, became more than just death sentences with beds. Some even began to separate patients by illness, which is basically the medieval version of please wash your hands. Your quirky tidbit for this section? In the decades following the plague, some towns saw the rise of the plague doctor costume, not during the original outbreak, but later, during subsequent resurgences. That bird-like mask with the long beak? It wasn't just for drama. It was stuffed with herbs and flowers to ward off bad smells and supposedly disease. Functional fashion strikes again. Culturally, there's a shift, too. Writers begin to experiment. Artists break from rigid religious motifs. Architects start building with light in mind. Vaulted ceilings, large windows, open courtyards. It's subtle at first, but soon it blooms into full Renaissance glory. Florence, Venice, Bruges, they all rise from plague pits with a kind of shimmering defiance. And something else changes too. How people think about death. Before the plague, death was expected, but distant. You lived, you prayed, you died. After the plague, death was intimate, familiar. You watched it gnaw through your family, your neighbors, your town. It became the drumbeat of existence. But instead of collapsing into nihilism, many people developed a sharper awareness of time, a desire to make life mean something. That's where the real legacy of the plague lies, not in the death toll, but in the rebirth. You see its fingerprints everywhere, in the way a farmer's son becomes a scholar, in the way a cobbler's daughter marries into a merchant family, in the way a city rebuilds with symmetry and sunlight, in the way a musician chooses to write something joyful, even if it's in a minor key. And here, high on your quiet hill, the world below you hums with all of it. You can feel the fatigue of the past, but also the strange, fragile electricity of renewal. And now we slow it down. The breeze softens as the sun sinks low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the patchwork fields below. You hear the rustle of dry grass, the distant call of a bird settling into its evening perch, and the faint clatter of a cart returning home, its wheels muffled by the dust of a well-worn path. The world, once shattered by pestilence and grief, begins to quiet. You can almost sense it exhale. Down in the valley, someone lights a lamp in their window. Its glow is soft, steady, a sign of warmth, of presence. Somewhere, bread is baking. Someone is singing under their breath as they mend a shirt, the needle dipping and rising like a lullaby. Life, in all its mundane beauty, resumes. You settle into the stillness, your body loosening with each passing breath. The memories of the night's journey, empty villages, bold peasants, whispered prayers, and velvet shoes, drift like mist across your mind, gentle and untethered. Each thought softens, stretches, and fades. The past doesn't vanish. It lingers in old stones, in winding alleys, in quiet bells that toll at dusk. But it no longer grips your heart so tightly. You made it through. We all did somehow. Let your eyes close now. Let the weight of the world slide from your shoulders and drift into the hush of sleep, where no plague can touch you, and time itself holds its breath.